Hello, my name is Dakota Diesel, and welcome back to Film of the Year. As we continue the latter half of the 1890s, today we're going to take a look and discuss the slow rise of projecting movies. Now, today's episode and the next one will be a double feature of sorts, mostly because there's not too much information or history when it comes to the people behind these projectors. And also the movies we'll be seeing are basically the same type of films we've seen before from both the kinetoscope as well as from the Lumiere Brothers in the last video. As such, there will not be an in-depth movie review in both this episode and the next one. These videos will mostly focus on the history and impact on these projectors. With that said, in the last episode we mentioned that the Lumiere Brothers cinematograph gained in popularity and no doubt helped capitalize the idea of projecting a film to a wide range of audience. However, that did not mean the Lumiere Brothers were the only ones to think on that idea, and even before the cinematograph came into fruition, there were other people looking to create a film camera and a projector of their own. One of these people that would eventually make one would be German inventor Max Skanalowski. Born on April 30th, 1863 in Berlin, Germany, Max was the son of Karl Skanalowski and Lucy Skanalowski, as well as the fourth child of the family. During his childhood, Max would develop an interest in photography and later magic lantern shows. Beginning in 1879, he and his older brother, Emil Skanalowski, would travel along with their father in giving the solved magic lantern shows. While Emil took care of the promotion, Max would set up the lantern itself, in which he would later develop special multi-lens devices that will allow simultaneous projection up to 9 separate image sequences. Between 1881 to 1890, the trio would present these magic lantern shows, as well as water fountains and mechanical theater shows throughout Germany and Central Europe. Even when their father would later retire from the show, the brothers kept on doing more magic lantern shows while adding new attractions. In the beginning of the 1890s, Max would later get the idea of making a chronophotographic camera with his brother. The idea was to make a camera designed for unperforated Eastman's Kodak roll film and using a worm gear intermittent movement. Max himself claims that he constructed this camera on August 20th, 1892, but it's most likely that he made the camera around the summer or fall of 1894, where he tested the camera by filming 48 frames of his brother, Emil. What we can say for certain is that by the midsummer of 1895, Max would be responsible for creating the projector for these films, which he would later name the bioscope. Inspired by the dissolving magic lantern shows, the bioscope consists of 2 lenses and 2 separate film reels, with the films themselves being 54 milliliters wide. Max would carefully cut each film reel before he would then perforate it and then reassemble them by hand, where he would then coat it with an emulsion developed by Max himself. The projector would be powered via by hand crank, with the film running at about 16 frames per second. With the projector completed, Max and his brothers set out to give a private demonstration of their machine at the Gasthaus Cello in the suburbs of Berlin, where the directors of the Winter Garden Theater, Julius Baron and Franz Dorn, were very impressed with the screening and the projectors, which would lead the two men to sign a deal with the Skanalowski brothers for them to use their bioscope projector for their theater, agreeing them to pay 2,500 Goldmark. With the contract signed, the brothers would show about 9 very short films at the Winter Garden Theater on November 1st, 1895. The films will last about 6 to 11 seconds, but each film will be put on a loop for a short while, making each film last as long as the brothers needed, and each film would be given their own score to help drown out the loud noise the bioscope would make. In total, the film segment lasted about 15 minutes, in which the last film would show the brothers themselves bowing in front of the camera before they would take a real-life bow when the show was over. When the show did finish, it seemed that the bioscope did well with the audience of the theater. However, the critics from the Berlin paper seemed skeptical with the machine itself. Regardless, the bioscope would have another showing in Hamburg on December 21st of the same year, but this is where problems started to arise, and the reasons as to how the bioscope would later be an obscure projector. While the brothers were getting ready to show their projector to the public, another team of brothers were also making their own film camera and projector, in which they too would also give a public demonstration in just a month after the Skanalowski brothers showed their bioscope. Of course, I'm referring to the Lumiere Brothers and their cinematograph that we just covered in the last episode. The Skanalowskis were supposed to have a showing at the Fräulein Berger Music Hall on January 1896, but after the Lumiere Brothers showed off their latest projector to the same music hall, the owner of that building was quick to cancel the Skanalowskis' presentation of the bioscope, due to the cinematograph being much better with its clearer image and with it being much easier to operate than the bioscope. but at the very least, both Max and Emil were still paid in full. The same thing happened to the brothers in London, where another planned appearance to show the bioscope at the London Empire Theatre was also cancelled. I don't have proof, but it's also possible that this cancellation might have also been because another team of inventors have also made a working camera and projector of their own, and have beaten the brothers to the punch of presenting their projector before Max and Emil. But again, I have no proof of it, so take that information with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, the brothers were at least able to show off their projectors in other parts of Europe, in places like Central Germany, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. During all of these shows, Max would create a new camera around the fall of 1895, and would even make an improved projector, this time a single-lens projector that can run a 63mm film strip, and Max would name this projector the Bioscope 2, and would be finished around the summer of 1896. However, this projector wouldn't last much longer than the last one, for on March 30th, 1897, Max and his brother Emil will host a final Bioscope show in Stettin, Poland, where Max's trade license had expired, and by this time, the Berlin authorities refused to lend Max a new one, believing that there were too many film licenses and exhibitors at this point. So just like that, Max was basically retired. But that didn't mean he was done working with cameras or film projectors altogether. He still stuck around the film business and would continue to produce and sell some amateur film cameras. But it is clear that none of his other inventions would be as popular as the Bioscope once was, and as such, this will be the only time we'll ever talk about Max Skedalowski. So what did Max do after his last Bioscope show? Well, aside from making film cameras as stated, Max will return to photography and will make a couple of flip books using his photographs, with some reusing his film footages, and he would also go back into giving magic lantern shows, where from there, he would found a little company titled Projection for All, where he would distribute 3D anaglyph lantern slides, and would also sell projectors, printing equipment, as well as cameras. His company would make some films between 1913 to 1914 with the help of Max's younger brother, Eugen. However, they would once again not meet the same success as the Bioscope. By the time Max was slowly reaching the final years of his life, as the cinema was growing, Max would make some claims about his own accomplishments in hoping to bring cinema into Germany, which some critics would debate about just how much of a role did Max actually play in the early days of cinema. Max would eventually pass away on November 30th, 1939, at age 76. While there is much debate if Max truly did help bring cinema to Germany, or how big of a role did he play, one could rightfully argue that at the very least, Max was one of the directors that brought people's interest in making movies, and I'm sure that there was someone out there that was truly inspired by what they saw when the Bioscope was popular for a time. Moving on to the next person, now we're going to talk about another projector and film camera both made in the UK, and the two people responsible for these cameras would be British film and scientific instrument maker Robert W. Paul and American and British photographer Burt Akers. Let's briefly talk about Robert first. Born on October 3rd, 1869, Robert would spend his childhood around the northern part of London, where he would attend the City and Guilds Technical College, studying electrical instrument makings. He would also work in an electrical instrument shop of the Lumiere Brothers, where he would gain more knowledge of the skill before establishing his own instrument-making company around 1891, naming it the Robert W. Paul Instrument Company. By this time, Edison and his team would still be working on their own film camera and viewing device named the kinetoscope, which we mentioned plenty of times in this series thus far. When the kinetoscope became a big hit in America, it was natural for Edison to start showing his machines around other parts of the world, and the European market was where it all began, starting in Paris on July 16, 1894, which would then be followed by another grand opening in Queen Street, London on October the 18th of that same year. It was this London show where two Greco-American exhibitors named Demetrius Georgiadis and George Trages would personally approach Robert Paul himself with the idea of making replicas of the kinetoscope with the goal of expanding their business by both exhibiting and selling these replicas across the country. At first, Robert was about to turn the men down on the offer, but once he discovered that Edison did not file a British patent for the machines, Robert soon agreed with the men that there was a business to be had with these machines, so he later agreed to make copies of them. However, during the first 2 months in making these copies, Paul would soon run into a problem. While the actual machine of the kinetoscope was legally free to make copies of, the actual films were still under control by the Edison Company. So if Paul ever wished to sell his own versions of the kinetoscope, he would need to make his own independent films. Luckily, a friend of Robert by the name of Henry Short would help Robert out by bringing another person that specializes in photography named Burt Akers. Burt Akers was born in Richmond, Virginia on July 23, 1854. By the time the American Civil War happened, both of Burt's parents would be dead, causing the then 14-year-old teen to be an orphan. Luckily, his aunt would be the sole guardian for the rest of Burt's own life, and she would send him off to Paris sometime in 1872 to have him study in fine arts and later photography. Burt would come back to the United States for a few more years until he became wealthy enough that he would later move to England in 1885 and permanently stay there for the rest of his life. Once he was settled in England, Mr. Akers would set up a photographic studio in Denver, where he would gain a good reputation that would lead Burt to soon work for Elliott & Son's own photographic materials studio around 1893, where he would manufacture dry plates and printing paper. It was during this time where an assistant to Burt Akers, Henry Short, would start to introduce Akers to Henry's friend, Robert Paul. Henry knew that Burt was the guy Paul needed in order to make some original films and a camera of his own, and so Henry would bring the two men together on February 4th, 1895, to discuss the idea into making their own film camera. The two men would meet at Paul's Haddington Garden address to discuss how the camera should be made, with Burt drawing up the initial designs and later patenting the camera that could take Edison's 35mm of film. After much testing and fixing a few things, both Robert and Burt would have their working film camera completed around March of that same year, naming it the Paul Akers camera. And for the first film, the two would shot their friend, Henry Short, outside Akers' own home, where it would later be known as the incident at Cloverleaf Cottage. After shooting plenty more films between March and June of 1895, both Paul and Akers would have enough films to be placed into Paul's own kinetoscope, where audience would see these films inside Emerald Kilfie's Empire of India expedition inside Earl's Court in London. While the film seems to be doing well with the audience, the partnership between Paul and Akers would slowly drift apart. While it's not completely clear on what caused this rift, it's likely to believe that during the making of the Paul Akers camera, Burt had began working on another movie camera of his own, naming it the Kinetic camera, to which Paul believed was almost identical to the other camera they were developing together, and it was this reason for the eventual split up between the two. With the split up, both Paul and Akers would work on their own film projections, with Paul publishing his first projection in the English Mechanic magazine on February 21, 1896. He would name this projector the Theodograph, which would later become the first 35mm film projector commercially produced for Great Britain. After about 2 demonstrations of Paul's new projector, the first model of the Theodograph projector would be publicly available on March 19th of the same year, inside the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. Despite the faults the first Theodograph presented, the projector itself was still met with warm reception, and within a few days after the launch of the first Theodograph, a second and improved version would be patented by Paul on March 2, 1896, and it was this projector that would inspire Paul to create his own film camera. With projecting movies slowly being on the rise, Paul was one of the first to see the many possibilities a film could do to bring in an audience. He would later set up a film studio in England, hiring other directors to make some films, one of which we will talk about briefly later in the series. Paul would stay in the filming business by either directing or producing whatever film was being made, and he would also make about 5 different Theodograph projectors, each with improving features and mechanics, such as a modern-day sprockets to prevent the film from wearing out. Paul would stay in the film business until around 1910. Not much is known about what Paul did during the final years of his life, but his contribution to the early years of film has certainly not gone unnoticed. He would later be known as the father of British film industry, but even with that title, Robert wouldn't quite reach the impact and success he did prior to introducing the Theodograph. As such, he would not be featured in his own video again in the near future, but he will still be mentioned briefly for a short while. As for Burt Akers, after the split from Paul, Akers would eventually make his Kinetic camera, to which he would bring into Germany to film the opening of the Kiel Canal, and even film the Kaiser, who at the time was William II. When he returned from his trip, Burt would begin making a projector for his camera, which would later be known as the Knopfkuhn. After giving a couple of demonstrations of his projector and films, Burt would later give his first public showing of his films on January 14, 1896, at the Royal Photographic Society in London, just about a month before Paul would give a demonstration of his Theodograph, and even before the Lumiere Brothers would give their demonstration of their cinematograph in London as well. It was also this month where Burt would form his own company, the Northern Photographic Works, which deals with coating, perforating, and processing film. While Burt's camera and projector was met with both financial and commercial success, much like how the Lumiere Brothers saw the future in films, Burt also had a different opinion when it came to how film should be shown and what a camera should be used for. While Burt would sell his films to other exhibitors, he felt that film should be more used for educational rather than entertainment purposes. So while Paul would be focused on the filming business, Burt would be traveling across the country giving scientific lectures. But at this point, his success would slowly die down by the end of the 1890s. Burt would attempt to regain the same successful fame by inventing a camera and projector device known as the Bernick. This device would use half of the 35mm film down to 17.5mm, and it was Burt's attempt to get ordinary people into making their own movies, the same way that George Eastman's Kodak camera would attract ordinary people into photography. However, by the time Burt revealed the device around 1898, another film production company named the Warwick Training Company would also make their own amateur sign camera titled the Biocam for just half the price of Burt's Bernick, thus hurting Burt's own sign camera success. Even so, Burt would actually continue to be in the film industry well into his death on December 27, 1918, at age 64. While Burt Akers may not be as well known as the likes of Paul, he does get the recognition he does deserve for all of his important work he contributed into the film world, both in England and Germany. But much like the Skanalowski brothers, we will not hear from Burt again after this episode. Even so, what all of these inspired filmmakers, including the Lumiere Brothers, have taught and show us is that the idea of projecting a movie for hundreds of people will be the way to draw in a big crowd, and in the next episode, we'll see how America would also move away from the kinetoscope to presenting their films into a projection screen. That will do it for this episode of Film of the Year. This is Accorda Diesel saying thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to see more episodes of Film of the Year, hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any movies or shows you would like for me to review while I work on this series, let me know down in the comments below. Or you can check out mine and Barney's co-op channel, Review Bros, where we review movie and TV shows together. Or you can check out my gaming channel if you want to see me play and even give thoughts on certain games. This is Accorda Diesel saying thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of Film of the Year.